Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and once again I'm filming an interview at the Science and Non-Duality Conference in San Jose, California. Today, my guests are Gurucharan Singh Khalsa and Karuna, and they are both students in the tradition of Yogi Bhajan, which is Kundalini Yoga. I became aware of Yogi Bhajan back in the 70s. I was with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and I remember he and Yogi Bhajan had a meeting. And then, as I recall, I was up in the mountains of France, and Yogi Bhajan wanted Maharishi to come to Mexico for some conference or something, and Maharishi just didn't want to do all that traveling, and so he didn't go. But as I recall, I heard good things about the meeting. So this is one of those interviews which I have not prepared for. I know very little about Yogi Bhajan, Kundalini Yoga, although I do have a good friend who's in this group, Kulmeet, who's up in the Ottawa
She's lovely.
center. Yeah.
Love her.
And I haven't seen her in years. Oh, yeah.
Great cook.
And
it's important.
For years I've been actually thinking of, I'd like to, in tribute to my friend Kulmeet, I'd like to interview somebody in that tradition, and I was kind of had that in the back of my mind when I came to this conference. I wonder if I'll meet somebody, and you guys would be the ones to talk to.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here with you.
Yeah.
I love the name of your company.
Thank you. It's not exactly a company, but it's a good name.
It's a great, well, it should be.
It's a 501c3.
There you go.
There's a donation.
That had to come up. You see, that's already Yogi Bhajan's working. He's already manifesting a huge prosperity for you. So
good.
Nice job.
So what I'd like to do in the next hour or so is have you give us what you feel is the cream of the message that you could give in an hour or so of what Kundalini Yoga is, what benefits, if it's relevant, what its history is, but maybe not too much time on that, because mainly we want to focus on the practical stuff. What would a person do if they were to get involved in this, and what benefits could they expect to get from doing it, and where would they have to go, and that kind of thing. Would they have to wear a turban or different kinds of clothes?
No, you can not wear a turban. I'm taking the turban off.
He's not gonna take his off. So yeah.
Well, let me start with that.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Okay, and then Karuna, you chime on in as you wish. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Look, Kundalini Yoga is essentially about how do you live a life that is one of consistent delight and elevation. As a human
delight
and elevation.
In elevation.
Yeah, in elevation.
Okay.
Because as a human being, we have that capacity to be with whatever the plot of our life is, and yet birth within that plot a story. Because the story is not the plot, right? The story is that thing that we write with our heart. It comes from that inner dimension that we talk about in spirit. Not all fuzzy and mystical in that way, but sort of powerful and present. But a lot of times we get caught just in the plot. And plots are interesting as plots and drivers, but the story is how we transform. It's the nature of our choices and what we do and how it develops us in our inner dimension. So Kundalini Yoga was always about how do you awaken the human, that possible human in us, and open the heart center and live beautifully within this world. Okay. Now, traditionally, let's say when I got interested in it anyway, this is old guy talk. This is back before internets, and half the journey was finding the bookstore and the dustiest book, and then learning to translate into Sanskrit, that kind of thing. Now you can get it on your watch or something, right? Yeah. But along with that, there was a lot of veiledness around this thing that I always heard about, Kundalini. Now the translation is varied, but essentially it means awareness, and it means the central property of you as a human being, which is awareness.
Kundalini means that.
Yeah.
I've always associated Kundalini with the Sushumna and the energy that rises up.
Right.
The spine.
So before you get into all of the interpretive symbology and iconology and the putting it into certain cultural context, if you talk about it experientially, what is it?
Right.
It means you awaken your sense of presence, that space of grace that you talk about. It's when you have a relationship in every breath, basically, to that. Now, every system that approaches that from all directions, right, has some kind of a map, fuzzy or otherwise, to kind of get there, and practices and such. And Kundalini is that way. the basic distinction to think of is in the Eastern way, right? You've got meridians and pranas and all that kind of stuff, or chi, these things. So you've got a whole energy system that has to do with balancing, right? Our senses, our attachment, our things like that. So think of that as one whole way of being, and that connects us to sitting in this place, you know, with these smells and colors and such things. And that's, to a Kundalini Yoga person, that would be equally real as the oneness. They're co-equal, they're co-extensive. They don't exist without each other. So it's never an issue that something is beyond illusion or in or out.
Right.
The question is, here, in my heart, in my experience, right, how do I act in a way, right, that delivers that kind of reality, authenticity, being of me as a person, right? So I've got these pranas and balancing flows and all this stuff going on that lets me particulate my experience and get it. And then there's this thing called Kundalini. So Kundalini, in this way of thinking, isn't like a prana. It's not an energy, actually, although people refer to it, but it's not what it is. It's more like you could call it the urge of self-transcendence. You could call it the inner dimension that starts to open the flower. So Kundalini then traditionally is looked at that as it, quote, rises. And it's very difficult in the West, because you think you're always climbing ladders and getting to the top. Okay, so you always got to put all the ladder stuff in a circle with a center. All right, so you have to kind of think it always is about this heart center, and around it are all of the different manifestations and challenges, right? So what constructs this outer rim of experience is all these pranas and stuff like that. But what brings us into transformation, what brings us into the height at which you might want to live, would be the Kundalini. So sometimes you have, you know, problems in the body and the mind. Or someone here said very nicely, you know, all of our human problems are psychological and all the solutions are spiritual, in the sense that we reconnect with the wholeness and the flow, the inner part, with the outer parts. We combine these. Or as I would say, take the heavens, take the earth, and bring them together at the heart. Because you know your being, your totality, right? And how you know is resolved by action, which is what we call dharma, right? Dharma is the right step at the right time in the right place in the right way that has a natural blooming quality to it, let's call it, which I call the fulfilled sense of destiny and heart that we are in our own authentic self. So Kundalini is about all the different ways, and so in this way, I mean, I founded the Kundalini Research Institute back in '72 or something. And so we've collected and put publicly now online just recently, literally thousands of meditations. And these were given and shared by Yogi Bhajan over the years. And those were collected. There's Sikh meditations, there's Sufi meditations, there's Christian meditations, there's things that we don't know what they were, but they were sort of passed on. So a lot of that tradition was oral. A lot of it was secret. A lot of it required initiations. So one of the things that truly attracted me, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one was that having been kind of raised in myself as a scientist and a mathematician and such, right? I didn't like things that were secret. I saw them as part as, I understood the esoteric side of it, but mostly it got applied as cultural hierarchy, basically, and binding. Okay, so I'd rather say that what is truly unique and subjective in each of us is ultimately the secret, and known only through our relations, interactions, and like that. It's not. There's no secret. The only secret is the uniqueness, because if it's unique, it's not comparable, right? So I kept coming across Kundalini references or something that would parallel that in Taoism and this and many different traditions, right? And a lot of them would say it's secret, it's this and this. But when I met Yogi Bhajan, he was the first one I met that said, no secrets, no initiations. If you can't initiate yourself, if you don't have the responsibility to engage in an authentic way your own soul, how are you going to make the progress, really? And so it appealed to me in the sense that it was open and I could test it. And then the prescription he gave was, try it, it worked for me. If it doesn't work, throw that away, try something else. And I said, okay. So that experimental approach and experiential approach appealed to me. Because I think that's how the universe does. I think the universe is a constant play, and I don't think it knows any more than we do. I think it's winging it. So someone says, do you know what God thinks? I said, yeah, God's winging it. And we're the wings. And so we are in a constant coevolution. And
like
that's the fun of
Harrison
it.
Ford in Raider of the Lost Ark. You know, somebody said, "What's the plan?" He said, "I don't know. I'm making this up as I go along."
That's right.
There you go.
And if we're joined with the one, so is the one. But it's it's funny ways of talking about it.
Right.
But I like the playfulness of it, because I think without joy and without coming from your heart and without embracing all the plot that you're in, without even knowing about it, how can you play an infinite game in a finite world? And you got to do both.
Good. Bruna, do you want to add to that? Or?
No.
Okay.
Oh, she does.
Well, I mean, the only thing that's coming up for me with listening to an amazing dissertation on Kundalini Yoga, you as a student of Yogi Bhajan and having really never had encountered Yogi Bhajan, this is as close as I can get. So my relationship with Guru Charan has just been so exquisite, because he actually gives me the leeway and the freeway to really be who I am in this process of a teacher. And with the teacher training programs and all the evolution that you get through the teachings on teaching on an everyday basis that I do in Boulder, that it helps you to grow and extend that authentic relationship that you were just talking about, with joy and humor and just being able to freely flow with these teachings, and not being somebody who's so, they're very physical in the sense of they move your heart. And that's how I look at physical. I don't look at physical as, when triathletes come to my classes and long distance runners and they're winning their races with the mantra of Sat Nam, Sat Nam, Sat Nam, instead of, oh my God, I can't do this. When I heard somebody in class say, today I can't do it, I was like, ow! I was like, no, you can. You have grit, you have passion, you have compassion. And it's, it's that movement that this yoga gives you that looks so wild, but it's yet so incredibly devotional. It's bhakti, shakti, and rag.
The yoga is wild?
The Raj of this yoga, this yoga, the Kundalini yoga is such a Raj yoga. It's a royal yoga. It wants you to become as enlightened, if you want to use these terms that we're using so much around here, or as awakened or awake in the sense of awareness of just how are we communicating with each other.
Okay, so let's say that, somebody wants to check this out, and they come to your center or your class or whatever. What specifically are they going to learn, and what are they going to take away in terms of a daily practice?
Well, we start with poke, provoke, confront, and elevate. That's a rule. That is a really, well, to poke, okay, so you start with a practice. And you poke. You start to poke those little things that don't feel so cozy in you anymore.
You poke your own things.
You poke your own things. So with the teachings of Yogi Bhajan, well, you tune in, and that could be a poke right there, just going, Om Namo Guru Dev Namo, what is that? And that pokes something in you, that asks a question, that provokes something in you, to confront something in you, to even ask, why am I even confronted by this? Why can't I just be in the experience, which is the elevation ultimately that you'll get by the end of the class.
So you might get a mantra, Om Namo Guru Dev, Guru Ve Namo.
Guru Dev Namo. So you might get a mantra, you might get a sound current that you're not used to in a class. So we really look at the things that you're used to.
Your eyes closed, or
you tune in. So if we were to rub the palms together at the heart,
so they don't rub them on the microphone.
right. This balances the right and left hemisphere of the brain.
It does. Okay.
So all of a sudden, and I say this to my brother who's an NFL football coach to tell his quarterback, like, tell him to do this, because this will balance the right and left hemisphere of the brain, and when he goes for the goal, he'll hit it. Because he's balanced. So it's fun. It's fun just to use the technology. No, just half a second. You actually don't even need to do it. You could actually just put the prayer mudra together. Put the thumbs into the thymus gland, turn the palms up, sit with your sit bones grounded, elevate from your crown chakra, and just feel that is a different frequency already. in
But
you.
if it's not too simplistic to ask, give us an overview. I mean, what is the whole scenario here that people are going to discover, and what sort of, without going into great elaboration on specific things, what are they going to be doing? What are they going to learn? What are they going to take home and do every morning or whatever?
In a typical class, you'll come and do an hour class.
Okay.
Let's say, and so you do something to tune in so that you're present. And then there's probably some talk or something to give some topic, right? And then you engage in what we call a kriya. And the kriya is a sequence of actions that leads to sort of predictable realms of exploration of yourself, okay? Now that'll include physical exercise.
Like yoga
Yoga, asanas, postures, breathing. It could be
Pranayama.
silent, using the breath control, that's right. Think of that there are tens of thousands of kriyas, okay? So there's a big bunch of stuff you could do. It's like any physical
But not
exercise.
all in 1 hour.
No. Some things are extremely simple, and I still do the very first one I ever learned. It takes like 20 minutes. That's good. But there'll be movement, stillness, out loud, silence, focus, non-focus, guided internal visualizations. So the variety of things you do is one of the kind of interesting things to me in Kundalini Yoga. Some it's like, here's the 16 things you do in sequence, and you get really good at that, which is a good thing. You can really master that. Kundalini Yoga is difficult. It's difficult to master it just because of the size of all the things that one could do, and it kind of focuses you on mastering yourself. And so each of these things is to help you in sort of consolidate that sense of self at your heart. So you come to class, you tune in, get a little talk, you go through some kind of kriya process, which usually involves meditation, either during the process or at the end. And the meditations, depending on the class and the purpose, might be anywhere from 3 minutes in advanced classes, half an hour, like that. 11 minutes to a half hour is very typical in these classes. And meditation and the physical movements and all this are completely integrated. They're not thought of as separate in that way. Okay. And then you consolidate and you close the class and you have some food and you have a little sangha and enjoy, right? Now out of all that, you'll have some experience, some elevation in yourself that you can find applications as you go into the world, because what you're taking is not a big bunch of stuff to do, but an alignment of yourself with whatever your plot is, as I was saying, right? That's what you're doing. It's like a tune-up, right? Now, just put one more little kick on that. When I said kriya, this kind of odd word, kriya, okay, it's a nice origin word, okay? So kri is like action, okay? Ya is infinity. It means being. Kriya means an action done with excellence in the presence and integration with the all. So it has the connotation of fulfillment and spontaneity. It has the connotation of rightness of the moment and kind of a flowering of the potential that was right there without effort. Okay? So then now you take the person. Now this is the big picture. You and I walk in and we got wounds, we do. They're good wounds, they're wounds that make us think, right? Precious pearls of pain, as we call them, right? Yes, we have those. That's why we have a good plot. And what good is a big drama with no villains and no challenges? I mean, we all get bored and go home, right? So we all have some fantastic drama or war we're coming from. Now, in that, we don't always use our best responses. We're automatic, we're impulsive, we have a lot of things. So we pattern our body, we pattern our soma, we pattern our thoughts, we pattern our beliefs in order to cope, right, with our own experience of ourselves and the plots and the families and the cultures and everything else we find ourselves in. What's the goal of Kundalini? Well, as you raise this Kundalini as part of the process, you start being able to reboot, basically, these patterns. So we talk about that in ways like, take this energy here, do this particular kriya, this particular process, this little journey of this kriya is like a gesture of internal energy that essentially accumulates it to, we say, the central channel.
The movements you're making are almost like Tai Chi. You're going like this.
Sure, because you bring these various movements and flows into, quote, the stillness of the central channel. So ultimately, you develop a sort of present stillness, and you start learning how to act from that stillness, because in the stillness, you're inviting a flexible wholeness so that you can do what? Notice what is. Where am I?
That's
What's
the key
happening?
right there.
And so we have a state. There's an old word for it. I kind of like this word. It's in the Sikh tradition. They call it Ang Sang Vaheguru. It's just fun to say it, you know, whatever it means, right?
Like so Shakespeare.
So you say Ang, it means like a part, an atom, a living consciousness unit. Ang, right? A part. Ang. Sang, all of them, like Sangat. Ang Sang. When your 30 trillion cells, Ang Sang, all come together in a resonance, and wow. The ecstatic, inexplicable moment is present. Wah, hey, right here, now. Wah, hey, not wah somewhere. It's not wah somewhere else, but wah, hey. Guru. Guru is now in the presence of transformative wisdom. So Guru, right? Darkness goes to light. Gu and Guru. Guru means a technology, technique, or procedure. So awakening the Guru through the stillness is to allow yourself to understand your own knowledge and bring out of that wisdom of how to act from the heart. So that's what it's all about. But what it's not about is really getting a philosophy. It's more about gaining a capacity of sensitivity, a sentience in your body, and a clarity in your mind, and a kind of embrace of wholeness in your heart.
Yeah.
Those are the three goals. And it just happens different.
Emphasis.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that attracted me. It's an experience and test. And Yogi Bhajan was a force of nature, and he would say, look, here's all these kriyas I'm sharing, and some were the Akashic records, some were things he learned. There was a lot of places these came from, but he would always say, look, I tried these, or I know about them, or whatever he did, and these are pretty good ones. And he'd say, there's a whole lot more.
How many do you need? I mean, you know.
One good one would really do
really.
just fine, you know. In terms of Kriya, just like good exercise, you don't want to just work your legs.
Right.
You want to use, you know, your love and your anger and all the emotions, and you want to
And also,
engage transcendence.
Yeah, a lot of them are specific for kidneys, adrenals, endocrine system, glandular system, the brain. You're working all part, you know, so if you come in with something that's failing you right now, in your physical body, mental body, you know, all your different bodies, even your heart. You know, you come in with heartbreak, there's a specific kriya that's designed that we can find for you to help you with your adrenals, to help you with your kidneys, with your, you know, with the whole system is covered in each kriya. So each kriya is designed around a different part of your body, actually. And it is up to the teacher to really read that before the class, to understand that before the class, because there is over 4,000 kriyas we can choose from. So think about it. If you're going into an hour or a 90-minute class, you have to be ready to deliver something to that class.
How in the world do you keep track of 4,000 kriyas?
Well,
Books.
yeah, we have a lot of,
So like a,
Online.
like a doctor who might have a pharmacopoeia he can refer to. You go and
Sure.
you figure, oh, this person has that. Let me
Sure.
check the
and
book.
it's quite, and of course it's very intuitive. So that, you know, it's very intuitive for the teacher to bring in the right kriya. And to really, and sometimes it has to be switched up because the class could be all of a sudden, you know, 80 and over, and you're not going to do, you know, awakening the 10 bodies in an, you know, you're not going to throw them into breath of fire in stretch pose.
This is
What if you have 30 people in the class and they range in age from 15 to 80? Do you somehow you customize it for each person?
Well, you cut not for each
Best you
person,
can.
and you really don't you know, pinpoint or, you know, point a finger or call out a name or anything. We have such regard for this whole group consciousness that it just it just works. Something works in it.
Again, think of the kriya as a flow, and everybody shares all the meridians and all the flows, right?
We all have the same heart.
So every
we
kind of
have a
kriya is
heart.
going to work one of these areas. So some people are very clear in that area, they find that sort of easy. Somebody else, there's more constriction, and it's like, wow, that was the greatest thing I ever did because I suddenly have all this free energy I didn't have. Another person who's really clear just goes, yeah, that was really nice. Whereas this person's going, amazing, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So there are general things, just like I'm playing jazz today, I got a little rock here, got myself a little bit of country dance, you know. And so you come in, and what you get in
like
Kundalini
that.
Yoga has a lot of variance because of the
makeup you come in
right.
with.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking
Yeah.
as a clinical, I'm a clinical psychologist, right? So I do destiny counseling and such things. But look, I have all sorts of trainings, right? Everything from, you know, cognitive and NLP, and I worked at Vinaya Satir and family therapy and all these things. So do you go to it like a what do you say?
Pharmacopoeia?
Pharmacopoeia, yeah. You know, and then select from that. No. With expertise, eventually you integrate all these things, and the focus is always on first perceiving what's real and what's unique in this person. If you can do that in terms of applications, right, then you know. And this is one of the things that I've had a chance to do over the years, is design the curriculums and applications for like addiction programs and prisons and executives and creativity and all this.
Cool.
And there it's about a syntax, you know, a particular grammar sort of, you know, of experience that just helps you go through a process that leads to what you want. So it's not just a prescriptive bunch of tools. People do like to do that, you know. What's the thing for the kidney in this? Because we want an answer, right? But ultimately it becomes about the individual or the uniqueness of the group in the situation, applying pretty universal tools that people will have their own experience in. Hence, we don't tell people you should experience the following and now you'll have samadhi and now you do this. Because that would counter the respect, in a way, in this tradition then, for what will surprise us and emerge.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm gathering so far is the teacher is important. It's not a learn from a book kind of a thing. You need a trained teacher, and it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of a thing. There's a whole toolbox.
Highly adaptable.
That's
right.
Very diverse and extensive toolbox of all kinds of things that Yogi Bhajan came out with, and maybe even you developed some or something. There's a whole lot of things you can do.
That's right.
And if you choose to get yourself involved with this, there'll be a lot of customization, and I presume that, and you know, so it'll be modified and adapted to suit your particular makeup and need and capacity and so on, and that you wouldn't just do the stuff in a class once a week or something, but there'd be, I'm presuming there'd be something you'd take home with you and do on a regular basis.
Yeah, sure. Well, number one, think of it this way. You know, there's a big, beautiful tree out there in the landscape, and some travelers need a moment of shade. They step under and then they leave, right? And others are going, hey, I want to eat some fruit from up there, and they get stuff from the tree, you know, and they take some food with them too, you know. And other people are going, you know, I'd like to actually just, you know, have a tree house, you know, and they stick around. So it's a very open system in the sense that you're not trying to be driven to a certain place. This is, let's meet you where you're at. What do you need? I'm happy for you on your journey. Yeah. You know, a concept you might like is, because people ask me all the time, well, is it this way or is it that way, and which is the way, you know, this kind of thing. And how do we do interdisciplinary and interspiritual and all these things? And I like to say, look, there's one way.
No way.
No, there's one way.
Right.
And whatever you're going to call that way, it's got lots of twists, like going up a mountain. And so in some part of it, it looks dark, and other it looks, you know, light, and other there's a water, and the other it's a clearing. But it's all just one path of the fulfillment in relationship with your whole being to your particular situation, right? And it's that elegance of being, it's that brilliance of mind that engages, that is what you're after. So sure, there's tons of different maps and all that, but it's sort of, but it's not the issue.
Yeah.
And so that's why I come back to saying an experiential base is important. And then tradition is important because it gives you other people's experience, it gives you some guidelines, because it's easy to be fooled and used and all that in a normal human way. So you like to have some guidelines that you can sort of check with or understand.
Boundaries. And they do need to be really aware of that individual soul, because anyone that comes into class is so unique and so authentic that if you have an understanding about how to open their heart and share the wisdom and the grace of this teaching of some kind of, then you can really see exactly what they need, and you can almost see it. You can really read it very compassionately and know that each one has a story. Each being that comes into your room, into your class, has a story, has a very authentic story to whom they are, and they know that story well enough to come and walk through that door and say, I'm willing. And that's all we really ask, is that we can open the door. We never close the door on anyone. Yogi Bhajan never turned his back on anybody. He was always willing to listen. to the story. And that's really important for people to understand that, you know, we don't have rules that say you can't come in, or I always have, you know, a chair there, a cushion there, you can stand up, you can do it, you can stand on your head the whole time, you can meditate the whole time. I don't, just get the energy of the room, get the sound current, because we use so much amazing sound current. And sound current being incredible, we have incredible musicians. The first thing that drew me to Kundalini Yoga was the music. You know, I was taken to Yogi Bhajan Samadhi. I didn't ever even meet him, and I was the first one there at his Samadhi, at his funeral. I was the first one there. I had no idea what I was even doing there. I didn't take the left turn into the right place, so I took the right and went straight to Espanola from Vail, and landed there, and the musicians were setting up, and once they set up, I was elevated into, like, my heart just opened up. I didn't even know who I was there for. I knew I was, suddenly something was happening in me. So that's what we really get into class, is that shift. There's something that happens with the energy that shifts it outside of any other type. Because I've taught, you know, Hatha for 20 years prior to becoming a Kundalini Yoga teacher, I never ever experienced that shift. There was a high from maybe sweating too much, but then there was this low in 20 minutes. I was like, oh my God, I'm angry again. But with yoga, with this yoga, it stays with you.
Yeah, that's one of the points I was going to bring up, is that I would hope that there would be a cumulative effect, and as there should be with any good spiritual practice, and that the longer you stick with it, the more it'll accumulate.
Sure. Yeah, and like you were saying, with the tree analogy, right, the tree metaphor, sure, we always give people practices if they'd like to do things outside of class. So a lot of people just come to a class and go. Yeah. But then if you develop, like anyone, a personal practice, a time where you're still in the morning, get up and take your cold shower, that's one of our favorites, you know, and then do some exercise, and then do some meditation. And really intentionally be present with what is that important thing in your purpose and heart for the day. So there's a practice, and we usually do a morning practice. But if you said, well, could you do it in the evening? Okay, you know. Well, is the morning special? Well, yeah, traditionally it is. You know, it's quiet, it's before the day has started. Everybody's prepping up, you know, it's not a bad time to go in there before the noise starts. Good idea. Oh, and there's mystical reasons and energetic reasons. But again, think of these things as enduring records of practices that have worked for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
That's
Did
the way
I hear you say you advocate cold showers?
I love cold showers, don't you?
I went through a phase.
Yeah.
For several years, cold showers. I was like into it. And I'm going to tell you a funny story. It's a little diversion here, but I was in Switzerland and living in this hotel.
And that's cold.
I was in the cold showers. Anyway, but they were working on the plumbing of Maharishi's rooms upstairs or something. We didn't have hot water anyway if we wanted it. So I'd go in the bathroom in the morning in Switzerland, and I'd start filling up. There wasn't a shower, it was a tub. And I'm sitting there on the toilet waiting while the tub fills, and the window's broken and snow's blowing in, you know. And I'm looking at that water, and it's kind of blue, it's so cold, you know. And then, gotta do it, get in there, and you'd be cold the rest of the morning.
Really?
Well, you know,
actually the theory behind a cold shower is you're warm, right?
Well, if your
when
room
you
is
come
also
out.
cold, it takes a while to...
But Switzerland
no, it's
is
a good
like
example,
that,
though, of, you know, technique and purpose, right? So the idea is to stimulate your skin and to use cold or whatever to sort of wake up and be fully present to your practice. That's all. So that's a nice, quick way in average climates. In average climates.
Yeah. And so people, since that was a bit of a facetious kind of little story, but this is not necessarily a austere thing, is it? Austere.
Austere.
No. If you have some, you know, grandmother coming in you mentioned 80-year-olds. You're not going to, you know, get her on beds of nails or anything.
No.
I mean, we also work a lot with Ayurvedic healing. So, you know, if you're a Vata type and that cold is hard on you, cold is sometimes hard on you. But if you know, you can also just stick your big toe in for half a second, you know.
Or in that case, do warm, cold, warm. Which will work perfectly fine.
There's a way. So one of the 5 sutras is that there's a way through every block. Just start.
Yeah.
You know, just start. You got to start somewhere.
Well, you know, one thing is, in the tree analogy, I kind of
Like that
I kind
analogy.
of stayed and built a house or something. So not everyone's going to do that, right?
Right.
My particular karma and interest was to do all this stuff for my life, right? 40 years, and I think origins are interesting. You know, how do you get? Someone always says, how do you get in this stuff anyway? You know, because you can come in and just have a class and go, right? You don't need to get into something. You find out what is in relationship to you and what you're doing. For me, it was part of a journey of knowing oneself and growing, and we had lots of connections that led to such long involvement. And I suspect you have some kind of, I haven't heard it, but an origin story of sorts of
Oh, yeah.
why you find yourself not even, you know, these kind of things. Ultimately, if you do the level that perhaps we've done, it's not really choosing, right? It's a feeling of calling, we call it, or
Yeah.
or
Being
oh, well, I realized I was always here, but I didn't know it, or God, I really don't want to do this, but yep, that my gut says I must. You know, there's a different level of
Yeah.
relation
I had
in
a
terms
story
of what
similar
we've
to
done.
Adyashanti. Did you hear his talk the other night? Remember how he said when he first heard the word enlightenment, he thought, that's it. That's what I need. I was like driving down the post road in Westport, Connecticut with three friends in the car, and some guy in the back seat was reading Ram Dass's book about Timothy Leary's translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and they started talking about enlightenment. I thought, that's it. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
Got to do that.
Yeah, kinda.
Yeah.
It's that direct relationship to the higher source, and you know, so many people say in these conferences, you know, I'm trying to get there, and actually we're there.
There,
We're
but
actually, we do exist there, but we like to drop down into, you know, becoming very lazy in a way, and yeah, it makes it, you have to make an effort.
sure.
And it is effortless. We talked about this, Gurucharan and he whispered in my ear, you know, it's effortless. And I was like,
Why, were you straining or something?
no, we were talking about, because they were talking about trying to find consciousness, the intimacy or the relationship with consciousness, and infinity. And actually, infinity and intimacy, the intimacy of understanding infinity. Remember we were talking about that whole
Yeah.
awaking place. There's no words to describe infinity. You know, how do you describe infinity? How I can't even say it. How do you?
I like to say you become intimate with the infinite,
That's
and,
what he
and
said.
in that relationship, then you show up unprepared, which means you're perfectly prepared, because how would you prepare for this anyway? But it's that sense, because life is exactly that way. If you think you're prepared and you know all that, you've already constrained it in a certain way. So you have the knowledge, you know the map of France or whatever, you know, but then when you get there, that's a different thing. So it's always this balance, I think, of what I call finite and infinite games, and then having the creative game of the heart, and that's simply put, that's the game. You know, like when I started this stuff, right? Just a few, like personal history, I guess. I don't know. How do you summarize a history quickly? As a kid, right? I wanted to know, basically, and I had these two modes of knowing. Okay, which is I'm asking questions and doing this. I had a grandmother who was Russian. Grandmother. She had survived the various things you survive in Russia and getting out of there. You know, this side's killed, that side. We had white and red Russians. They both killed each other. So, all right. So she got out and went through Canada and decided to go up there on the farm, and a huge farm, you know. And she put me on her knee one time. She says, "My Zolokov, my gold, my precious. Never trust a priest. They live on the darkness of the heart, and they take the blood and turn it into money." That's what she told me. So I'm this little kid, and she's telling me, because she had a certain experiences apparently in her life, you know. I listen to that and say, yeah, whatever, okay, you know. But then we'd sit down and we would fly with the birds, or we would know when to do this, or you know, I always had an amazing sense of that. Not mystical, but that sort of standing at the mystical edge, that sort of mystic stance, you know, where when you open to the vastness that's there, when you allow awe to be there, then there's a kind of way you're with things, you know, just that. She was the furthest thing from a philosopher. She was a hardcore organizing farm woman, right? But she would have these moments of stillness. Now I didn't call it then. And then she'd sit down with me and we would do that. Or one time she said, "Go with the cow." And I said, go with the cow. So I'm a little kid, okay. So I said, okay, sure. I went with the cow, and I went over and I'd stare at the cow, and the cow would stare at me. You know, this thing was going on. Cow staring. It's probably similar to have a new school. You know,
We do
cow.
it in Iowa all the time.
Okay, well in Iowa, you know, cow staring school. So I was initiated into the cow staring school by my grandmother, right? But I noticed that it was so easy to just merge. I wasn't thinking merge, but that's what happened. I would simply merge, and the cow. And I don't know, no one was pushing, but it would respond. So I could go like this to the cow, and the cow's head would go around, and I go this, and the cow would stop like this. So later, you know, this is a funny story. I was in Rishikesh, right? And so I was, you know, it's like all advertising, you get computer programming and or gurus, you can pick your avenue there. And I wanted to get some incense to take over this temple. So I was looking, and then suddenly I'm nudged from the back, and it's
It's a cow.
big one.
Yeah.
You know, they're not like little guys there, you know, like the horse ones.
Yeah.
And so I looked, and I kind of went right back to that first way of knowing, you know, just fun. It's a fun, I didn't, no big purpose, just, hi cow, you know. And I looked, and the cow started looking at me, and I started looking at the cow. I felt quite young for a moment, you know. And then I did this little thing, and he started doing the head, and I go like this, and the cow is fixed in space like this. And we just sort of held that stillness together. And then I laughed. I said, cow, and you know, it shook itself and like this. And the guy behind me in the shop was watching this. He says, free incense, free incense. So the cow gave me free incense. You know, that's how I look at it. It was a cow benefit, you know, from my initiation in cow staring, right?
They have those snake charmers with the cobras, and then they have cow charmers.
That's right. And so,
You're a cow charmer.
but it was a kind of openness to just experience, you know, in these funny nature ways. So I was always a nature boy in that way,
Cool.
right?
But,
And then-
yeah, but that brings me to thinking about, you know, how I'm working with the children now. And how old was that when you were with the cow? 5?
Yeah, about that.
Because when we're, you know, when the 5-year-olds come to my class, I have 5 through 14-year-olds. They're coming to class, and I put them deliberately together.
Yeah.
Because the 5-year-olds are like that, inquisitive, inventive, remind me of everything I said about from the class before. They actually start teaching the class at 5. And then, you know, and that's the memory that we were trying to figure out in these lectures about where does it start from? Where do those memories come in that are relived through your adult life, that are remembered, you know, way back when you were a kid and on that farm having a relationship with that cow for a half a second, relived when he's in his 50s now, you know, in Rishikesh, India. Where is that journey gone? Where is that remembrance come from originally, and where is it reminded to us later on in life? And it is really in our spiritual practice that we can remember these things, because we're so silent. We become so one with ourselves. We get to know ourselves again as when we were a child. And in that innocence of remembering, that brings so much joy to our cells, meridians, our nadis, our brain like awakens to creative consciousness within and around us, and we become one again. We become so happy again. And this, Yogi Bhajan said, happiness is your birthright. And to come back home each day, can you imagine if you sat still each day and found that stillness, what would actually arise from not living in the past, but from the now, the presence of your being now, and what you're going to expand into. And that's the fun of it, and that's the joy, and there's so much humor in that.
Now, to finish the farm analogy, right? I also would go out, and no animals were harmed in this. I'll tell whoever cares, right? But this is the farm fun, right? So I would go out, and you put a log, and then you put another beam, and then you take the chickens and you move them around and put their head in. You hypnotize the chickens. Then you put them on the end, and then you're a little kid, right? And then you do it, and you launch the chicken. So the chicken goes up in the air because it's there, and it wakes up in midair.
And starts flying?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's what they do. But what I started doing was going, well, how long does the beam has to be, and how high would the chicken go, and what would the time of thing? And so then I would start taking notes, and I'd start figuring out the system. So that was the other side of knowing. There was the merger, the cow steering, right? And then there was the chicken plotting, okay? Now, the chicken plotting later became science because then I got involved in, as a young kid and onward into high school once we had the space programs and people wanted to find kids. So I had a 6-room, 7-room maybe, school out in Oregon woods, basically outside of Portland. And then they came around and said, hey, who are you, you know? And so I started physics, chemistry, math when I got to, by the time I got to college, right? I was a triple major in that. I skipped 2 years in physics and math and so on, and was very interested to know what could be known, the beauty, like Frankel. And he and I were talking, we're like so related, I get it. Because you go to a certain level of beauty, of aesthetic pattern that just strikes you like a big flower in the world. Everywhere you look, you see these amazing, colorful, engaging, poetic flowerings of existence, and you can mathematize it. You know, so I was fully into that, and so my early idols in that time, although I still was cow steering, was you know, Eddington and Einstein and this, and you know, all the great mathematicians. The German, so I studied German, read the German texts. And so then I was in Westinghouse, I got scholarships, blah, blah, blah. You know, so I became very heady and very fascinated in my own kind of aesthetic way with all of this. Okay, now, here I am with 2 ways of knowing. And the more I get into the science, and I went to Harvey Mudd, which is a top 2 engineering schools, right? So it was like, from here you go to nuclear science or something, you know. But, you know, I started having a beard, and I was vegetarian. There were no Sikhs then. There was no Kundalini Yoga then, right? But people would, when I talked to me through the grid in the door to make sure their security clearance wasn't lowered, you know, by talking to me. So it was that period of time, right? But I was fully engaged in this, the pursuit of what? Some kind of knowledge and cow steering as well. And so I always had the 2 sides. So I had many artist friends and artist colonies, and I always had these 2 sides going on, 2 ways of knowing, you might say. But I got to a certain point, and this brings us to Yogi Bhajan, I got to a certain point where, without describing the details, it was one of those mystical moments we tend to get in our life. And I was alone, 2 in the morning, and so on and so forth. And finding a little bit of green in LA, it was at the time. And it just hit me in that way that is not arguable. That said, oh, I forgot one thing in my equation, mathematician. People must be in the equation or my whole system doesn't work. And it's sort of like, you know, you see those funny diagrams where the woman's, they have the diagrams that, oh, I forgot to have my child, you know, because I got too old.
Oh, she left her child on the bus.
Or something like that, yeah. Well, it's sort of like, well, I always love people. I've told them about people, and I was always cow steering and people steering too. And then suddenly I realized I can't know a certain aspect. And I could see that in the people I was with, because I was with some of the most brilliant people you can imagine. And they had drug problems, they had this, they had their lives still were messes, they still had brilliance, but there was a missing kind of core. And I looked at that, and so then I started helping a guy named Mansour with the drug counseling and this sort of thing. He was a beautiful psychiatrist guy there. Started just exploring, and I had been exploring even in high school, actually, mystical things and parapsychology and such. But I really realized that people was the fundamental thing that had to be in the equation. So I said, okay, there's got to be a way that I've got to rebalance this heart. Now, I had no teachers, or, well, that I would identify anyway, you know, maybe my grandmother. A few beetles I saw watch on the ground. Anyway, a few things. A lot of reading. And then I just started meditating more and doing whatever I could find at that time. I studied a lot of stuff, and this Kundalini stuff kept coming up. And I kept thinking, you know, I really like, there's something here. I could tell there's something here I need to do. So then, the beginning of the story we were telling was you start having these dreams, right? And so for like 3 months, I would have this recurring dream. And every time it would come up, and it would say, this date. So I'd literally see it like a date, like a ticker tape date sort of thing. Not a very nice dream. And I would get more and more in argument with that dream. I did not want to have this dream. I was ticked off because it looked to me like what I'd seen around me in the 60s. People were drugged out, spaced out, dreamed out, you know, trying to transcend and full of illusion and craziness. It was fantastically creative, but sort of from a scientific point of view, whoa, where are you going to go with that, you know? Really? Is that going to get you that? Are you going to really depend on some other new thing? So to me, this was like, I mean, I always had, as a kid, I mean, you'd see auras and lights, and so I was aware of those realms. But I was also aware of how attached people get to those sensations as if they're solutions to something, which I don't agree. So here I found myself having this sensation that I didn't want to agree to, you see. So it was called an upset, stage 1, right? Upset. So that day came, right, 2 months later, and I said, that's it. I was working on a Sloan Foundation grant for engineers to give them experience of who they build stuff for. I said, I'll lock myself in the room, which I did. I'm not doing nothing. Because, you know, that thing was telling me to stay. So 3 times people knocked on the door and asked stuff about meditation because they knew I was doing it. The third guy who came handed me a little, yeah, I saw this brochure, you know. So I looked, and there was a little teeny ad about this big that says Kundalini Yoga. I went, oh yeah, sure. Nobody's teaching Kundalini Yoga. And in those days, nobody did. No one called it that. And so I looked, I said, really? And I said, Yogi Bhajan. And this is when he first arrived. He was in LA. So I called up. I could not, you know, I mean, yeah, it's not like I said, oh, this is the day for this. It's just that there it was, and I hadn't actually associated it. I said, oh, okay. So I called up, I said, yeah, hi, is this, you know, someone answered and goes, Satnamji. And I saw, you know, visions of bean sprouts and long flowing dresses, and I said, I don't know, it's through Southern California for me, you know, engineer, I don't know, you know. And I said, okay, look, what's the initiation? He said, oh, there's none. I said, no, okay, so after you do it for a while, what's the initiation? You know how you do, hand a flower first, then you, no, it's totally open. Really? Anybody can come? Yeah, really. And it's Kundalini, are you sure it's Kundalini? Da-da-da-da. We had a discussion. I said, oh, that's incredible. Okay, so where is he? Well, today he's not here. He's in Claremont College. That's where I was.
Are you there?
Yeah, Harvey Mudd College, yeah. And then I said, oh, what? Well, he's giving a lecture in a half hour. Oh, where? Well, out my window. Oh, okay, thanks. So I went to the class. How could I not, right? So then I went, and it was a fantastic class. Most of you couldn't understand him. He was fresh off the boat, as it were, and so he was like a drill sergeant because he had military training, and so his classes were like, drop the left leg, and you go, left, no, the other leg, you know, you're trying to understand the accent and all this, and he was like, I had never had a class like that, you know. I mean, usually it's like, you know, supposed to have these Hittleman postures or something. No way. This was like tsunami time, guys. And then you get to the end, and it was like, go into stillness, be this, and then boom, there I was. And the auras got so bright in that room, you had to have shades, you know. It was like that. I mean, you know, normally it's a little bit of this and that, but I mean, this was ridiculous. And so I went, this is the real deal. This great. So exactly, I went up to him at the end of class, right, first class, and I always remember this conversation because I went up and I said, you know, it's a student, and I was in grad school by then and had done scholarship. And so I went, sir, I have a question. And he just looked at me, and it happens like this quick. There's no, you know, he's looking at right there, and he goes, you're stupid. I said, wow, what a great way to start rapport, right? You're stupid. Oh, well, but, you know, the mind's going, yeah, but I'm a mathematician, I'm doing this, I'm in physics, I'm doing scholarships, you know. But in a half a second or something, he's on a different conversation than I am, right? This is another conversation. And he just looked at me and he said, tapped me on the side of the head, he says, you're a teacher.
You're a teacher?
You're a teacher. And that's the answer, you know. And I was like, okay. And then he smiled.
You're a stupid teacher? Is that what he said?
No, he said you're stupid because I'm asking the wrong kind of conversation, right? Yeah, you're a teacher, right? Yeah, no. And then he looked at me and he says, I don't have time for your nonsense. It's smoggy, and it was really smoggy in those days. I came all this way to see you. I'm like, who the hell am I, you know? And he says, are you with me or not?
But he didn't beat around the bush, did he?
You know, and I had no idea what he's talking about. You know, show me the contract. What is this, a short-term loan, or what is it? What do you mean, am I with you? You know, I mean, really. And then I got that look in his eyes that it's sort of an amused, clever, entertained, zeroing look. That's how I explain it, you know. And so you kind of look, and I realized it was the same thing as that stupid look he gave me, you know, because he just said, "Are you with me or not?" And I remember very explicitly I stopped, he stopped me, I guess, and my breath went zero, and I looked at him in a way that you kind of remove your concepts a bit, you know, like, psh, and I just had this whole body, every cell recognition, and I went, "You're my teacher." And I said, "Yes." And it was exactly the kind of yes you say. When I met my wife, 43 years now together, I met her one day, she moved in a day and a half later, and we've been 43 years, and it was, this is it. And it is. And of course you work on it every day, you know. But it's it. There's no question. There's not a assessment of plus and minus.
Right.
And exactly with him, he took me in the very first meeting beyond plus and minus.
Nice.
And so then he laughed. He started laughing. He had a great laugh. Took me down to the cafeteria and said, "Come on, I'm going to read you the rules." And he sat down and he started, and we had a long conversation, and it was very, very funny. And then when he left, he had a Shakti, who was his very first student, was driving him, and you know, he waved goodbye. So he's driving out, and suddenly the car stops, and you see a big finger, and he loved to do this kind of thing, you know. So run down, "Sir," you know, and he brings down a thing. He says, "Do you remember that class?" I said, "Every moment of it, sir." He says, "You teach that tomorrow.
Wow.
Start teaching." And then he started to leave, and then he stopped again, you know, so I'm going here, and then you know, and he's probably having fun, you know, just go further, let's see if he'll run, you know. He's playful, right? But I didn't know, I'm just being very serious. So I run up to the again, like, "Oh my God, what happened?" You know, and he says, "If you don't see me again until you die, this is enough."
Wow.
And then he left.
Kind of dramatic.
It was, wasn't it? Yeah. So then I went back to that sort of dream thing. I went, okay, I get it. And so that began a long relationship. That was 1969. And the very beginning of it, I was already running, so I started running an ashram. I started ashrams, communities, all the long story after that. But that was the origins, coming from what? I want to know, I like to understand, I don't want to put humans into the equation. Well, to do that, I took a little 40-year journey here to clear out the insides, like we've been talking about, get rid of the blocks, be a counselor of destiny and opening these things for people, because I believe that that's important to have a life like that.
Very nice.
And so now I'm doing consciousness and science and the mathematics of consciousness, and working with my team at Chapman University, Jeff Tollickson, and Kira Harnoff and others, and now that's what I want to dedicate myself to, doing as good a clinical practice as I can, but now taking the teaching, because I've established the school, that's global. Now the question is, can we now do some of this modeling that takes those two types of knowledge and finds some kind of bridge that's not, as Frankl said in his lecture, he says, well, you finally know the temptation is that your math and all that elegance could somehow capture, right, all this transcendence, which of course it can't. So I'm interested in what I would call the emergent boundary between the oneness that is what we are and the parts through which we express, and the manner of that arising does have structure. And that is where this one type of knowledge meets the other. But you can't even ask the question of how to approach that boundary unless your heart is open, unless you're present, unless you're not seeking anything, you already have that. Because then your intuition can give you forms that give you one of many, many ways of doing it. So that's an origin story that kind of, I don't know, might be what you like.
Might be interesting. Now, I kind of need to keep this to about an hour because there's something I have to get to. And so what I'd like to ask at this point is that if people are interested in finding out more about this, what do they do? Is there a website? Are there centers all over the place, or here, there? How do they connect with you guys in order to learn more?
So as far as Kundalini Yoga, there's a lot of websites that list Kundalini Yoga teachers. It currently has a website, which is...
I have a website, which is www.lightonkundalini.
And then there's a general website through HO, Healthy Happy Holy Organization.
Yeah.
There's Kundalini Research Institute has a website.
So what I'll do is I
we'll post that stuff,
I always put a page on Batgap for each interview on batgap.com. So I'll put a page, and you can email me whatever you want me to put on that page in terms of websites, and books, or anything.
No,
else.
and if somebody wants to get me for any of the reasons, coaching, lectures, teaching, whatever,
sure.
Yogamaster at AOL.com.
Okay, well, we'll put your email on the site.
But I like it because who uses AOL, you know? And it's like not even Yogamaster 1001 because I love living on the bleeding edge of technology.
Right.
So back in the old days, AOL was the beginning, right? So it's still there, Yogamaster.
Okay, so I'll link to all that stuff.
It's fantastic.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. So this concludes another interview. I think I'm going to do at least one more while I'm still here with Unmani. Not that people are necessarily looking at all these in order, but if you're familiar with this show, I don't need to tell you all the details, but if you're not, this is an ongoing series, and if you go to batgap.com, B-A-T-G-A-P, and just explore the menus, you'll find out what it's all about. At this time, there are over 250 interviews to listen to or look into, and we have them categorized in various ways. So there'll be a category for Kundalini Yoga now.
Yes,
and then you know, if you'd like to be notified of future interviews, or notified whenever an interview is posted, there's a place to do that. There's a donation button. There's a place to sign up for the audio podcast if you don't want to just watch the video.
Fantastic.
So go to batgap.com, check it all out. Thank you for listening or watching. Thank both of you.
And as we would say in the Kundalini Yoga world, Satnam, and many blessings to you all out there. Thank you.
I appreciate
so
your time
much.
and your audience. I want to give one plug. There's a most recent book I did, The 21 Stages of Meditation, which is a really lovely book, frankly, and I mean, the printing, and a beautiful thing, and we're doing those kind of courses around the world. I'm on my way to Europe. So that's, if you really want a good hit, get that one, The 21 Stages. That'll give you a whole lot about the system.
On Amazon or something?
You can get it off Amazon.
So I'll link to it.
21 Stages of Meditation.
From the Batgap page, I'll link to it. Okay, great. Thanks.
Satnam, bye.
Satnam, everybody.
Satnam. Yay.